Welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast. In today's episode, Danette talks about listening to understand, which is a really important skill if you want to up your EQ. As we know, EQ is very connected to success, so enjoy this episode. It's a long one, but it's a good one. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Magical Learning's podcast. My name's Danette Fenton-Menzies and I'm the Director of Learning here at Magical Learning. Today I thought we'd talk about listening. In particular, I love this quote by Stephen R. Covey, which says, "Most people do not listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply." So I have a question for you. When you're listening, do you mostly listen to reply or do you mostly listen to understand? What we find is that most people have been taught to listen to reply rather than understand. When we listen to reply, it creates a bit of a disconnect between us and the other person, whereas listening to reply actually creates connection, and it also helps us build the emotional intelligence skill of empathy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Now, you know I love quotes, and I'm going to start with this one from Diogenes, who said, "We have 2 ears and 1 tongue so that we would listen more and talk less." Unfortunately, we often don't apply that advice. Now, one of the things we should be careful for when we are listening is our biased listening. And that biased listening is characterised by when we jump to conclusions. Particularly, we might have a belief that I don't need to listen to this, I already know this. Really catch yourself when you do this, because it is you shutting off. You're not listening to what the other person is going to be sharing with you, and you may miss some really important nuances that they were sharing with you. There is, in fact, a strong link between listening and learning. We're going to cover that shortly. I love this particular quote from Alex Lickerman in his blog, The Art of Silence. And in it he wrote, "Listening is far more powerful than speaking. You learn nothing by saying something which by definition you already know." And the Dalai Lama said this beautifully as well. "When you talk, you are only repeating what you already know. But if you listen, you may learn something new." Now, why don't we listen particularly well? Well, there was a study from Carnegie Mellon University which showed that the human brain has the capacity to digest as much as 400 words per minute of information. However, we only speak at about 125 words per minute, which means our brain has excess capacity, and what it often does is it tries to multitask. The problem with that is then we miss what is actually being said. I love the book Limitless by Jim Quick, and in it he suggests an approach to help us to listen with our whole brain, which is really what we want to do if we want to listen to understand the other person. And he uses the acronym HEAR, HEAR, and HEAR stands for, well, the H stands for halt, become present. Once we're present, the E stands for empathy. Feel what the other person is saying from their perspective. And I'll give you a couple more hints about that a little bit later on. The A stands for anticipate. So what you want to do is engage in their sense of anticipation as they're sharing information with you so that you get in the same sort of emotional state as the other person. And the final R stands for review. And review would be perhaps you asking some clarifying questions. You might ask for a point to be repeated if you weren't quite sure about it. And the idea is that after the conversation, perhaps go away and reflect on what you learnt through that conversation and think about how you might share that information if you were teaching someone else. It's a really lovely way to get all of the brain engaged in what the other person is sharing. And I really love this Ernest Hemingway quote, which says, "When people talk, listen completely. Most people never listen. And that quote actually reminded me of a fabulous book by a gentleman called Hugh Mackay. And the book is called The Good Listener, a fabulous, fabulous book. And in it, Hugh Mackay shares several reasons why people are reluctant to listen. So often we don't have the courage to listen to others because if we really listen to another person, it means we might need to entertain that our beliefs, thoughts are wrong. Another reason is that listening actually makes us vulnerable when we're doing it really quite deeply, listening to understand. Again, because we might find out that we are wrong. In this busy, busy world, listening also involves us being generous. We need to be able to be present and fully there, focused on the other person, and that requires generosity. It obviously also, because of how much our brain processes those words compared to how we say them, it requires us to be patient. So we need to slow ourselves down and fully focus on what the other person is saying. The other thing that he says about listening is it's an experiment. So when you're listening, you're basically building that relationship between yourself and the other person, and you're trying out their ideas. That means we have to be open to learning. And it requires cooperation. So we need to reciprocate. So basically, if you don't listen to someone, then why should they listen to you? So remembering that there are a number of reasons why we don't tend to listen or are reluctant to listen. However, if we want to improve skills like our empathy skills, which is an emotional intelligence skill, if we want to improve connection, trust and rapport, then our ability to listen to understand really does help us. I love Brene Brown and her book Dare to Lead. In it, she talks about empathy skill number 1 is to see the world as others see it, or she calls that perspective taking. What most people don't realise, and I've noticed this very much as I coach people, is that we all believe that everyone sees the world as we do. That is not correct. We all have our own unique lenses that we look through the world from. And those lenses come from our past, from our experiences, from who we are, from what we focus on. And therefore, it is really important to listen to understand, because what we're seeing is not necessarily another person's reality. And if we want to create that connection, we really do need to hear their perspective. So Brene Brown talks about while we can't necessarily take our lenses off, we can honour other people's perspectives, particularly as they are those people's truths. And they will be different from ours. And that's why listening to understand can really help us build that connection by understanding that different perspective. Now, what I love about this particular part of the book is she talks about perspective taking requires us to become the learner, not the knower. And I'm just going to read out of her book, and this is on page 145, where she talks, as we push on these issues and discover our own blind spots, we all have them, we need to stay very aware of the armour assembly process here. We cannot practice empathy if we need to be knowers. If we can't be learners, we cannot be empathetic. And to be clear and kind, if we need to be knowers, empathy isn't the only loss, because curiosity is the key to rumbling with vulnerability. Knowers struggle with all 4 of the building blocks of courage. Isn't that interesting? So by being a learner rather than a knower, we are able to understand through our listening and build that connection. I really love this quote by Krista Tippett. Listening is about being present, not just about being quiet. So again, when we're listening to reply, we're quiet. We're not necessarily present because our mind is ticking over thinking about how do I reply to that. When we listen to understand, we are both quiet and we are also present. Some simple things you can do to listen to understand. First of all, make eye contact with the other person. Smile at them. What you're doing is signalling to their brain that I'm here and I'm your friend. And then settle in and relax. This is where becoming present, paying attention is really important. Make sure that while they're speaking, you don't interrupt. Because when we interrupt another person speaking, it actually fractures their thought process and makes it hard to recall what they were sharing. Instead, focus on being silent. The beautiful benefit of this is it increases our ability to concentrate, and this leads us through to new knowledge. Again, some skills that Hugh Mackay shares in his book, The Good Listener, is first of all, receive the message before you react to it. So don't judge it, just listen. Sit and be silent and listen with it. Become aware of your trigger words and don't get distracted by them. Just because someone uses a trigger word, for example, if you've had a bad experience with a bank and someone says that bank's name or a telco, you will generally get triggered by that. If you know those words ahead of time, you can go, oh, they just said that name. Stay with the conversation. You can ask yourself questions such as, what can I do about this? How can I use this? And remember that actually deep listening requires a lot of our brains functioning. Therefore, do it in shorter periods of time if you can, because to really listen is hard work. That means it might be easy to listen for a little while, maybe 10 minutes, and then say, okay, I just need a quick break. Get up, just digest that information, and then come back and check in that you understand. Slow down to their speed. Don't let your brain's thought process take over. And make sure that you do try to understand what is it that they are feeling. You can do that through mirroring their body language. And it is really important once they've stopped speaking to reflect back, ask those questions to clarify your understanding, or ask them to repeat something if you really didn't understand it. Some lovely questions you can ask yourself while they are just starting to talk is, what is, insert the person's name, feeling? What does that word they just used mean for them? And beautiful phrase is, tell me more. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? I want to understand. I want to understand your perspective. When it's time for you to repeat back, beautiful phrase, what I hear you saying, have I got that right? Did I miss anything? Here you're asking to clarify, have I understood where you're coming from? So I hope this has been helpful. I really would encourage you to look at your listening and look at whether you are listening to reply, which will create more disconnection than connection, or whether you're willing to sit in that beautiful space of silence and presence and just listen to understand the other party. I'm going to leave you with a beautiful quote. This is from Alfred Brendel. The word listen contains the same letters as the word silent. Until next time, stay magical.
Thank you for listening to the Magical Learning Podcast. This month, we are doing a whole month's theme on creativity and innovation. We've got a webinar that you can check out either on this podcast feed or via YouTube. And we've got a bunch of stuff on our social medias about games that inspire creativity and the like. If you feel like you want to be a bit more inspired creatively at your work, this is the time to do it. So check out our pages and enjoy that. Have a magical week.